Good morning. How's everyone doing? My name is Esteves. I'm the Executive Director of the Lenny Zakim Fund. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation, the intersection of racial equity and philanthropy. On behalf of myself and the panelists, we hope you find this conversation useful, informative, and provocative as well. So thank you for joining us. We're all friends here. What I'm going to do is introduce my fellow panelists today, and then pass it on to Bithiah Carter, who will be our moderator for the day. Also, as you are already familiar, because many of you probably do Zooms all day long, you can add questions in the chat room so that we can get to those questions near the end of the discussion. So with that being said, I'll introduce my fellow panelists, starting first with Imari Jeffries. He's the Executive Director of King Boston and brings a wealth of experience in the nonprofit management field, community activism, education reform, and social justice. Bithiah Carter is the President and CEO of NEBiP, New England Blacks in Philanthropy, and she has a passion for philanthropy and fueling the 21st century mindset by shining a light on racial assets and how they can be leveraged to improve education, workforce, and economic resources in our communities. Miki Akimoto is a board member of the Lenny Zakim Fund and the co-chair of our Community Investments Committee. Her other current and past board service includes TSNE Mission Works, the Full Frame Initiative, and the Maine Philanthropy Center. Rahsaan Hall is a trustee of the Himes Foundation and also the Director of Racial Justice at the ACLU of Massachusetts. And lastly, Orlando Watkins. He is the Vice President for Programs at the Boston Foundation and formerly the Executive Vice President at Match Education. With that, I'll pass it on to Bithiah.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I am really, really excited about this conversation for a few reasons. We were so fortunate last month to actually have a conversation with King Boston, and I think Lenny Zakim had joined us as well, on really thinking through what do we mean when we talk about anti-racist? What do we mean when we think about equality? What does this new language of racial justice mean? Now we have everyone talking about racial justice, whether it's Mitch McConnell to Ford Foundation, really trying to say, put a stake on the road of what does it mean to move forward in an anti-racist way. And I think it is really important that we really kind of understand this from a philanthropic point of view. And this is an open discussion. I'm going to start with my colleagues here, but we invite you to also chat and really think through in the chat room and answer your questions there. But also we have two questions that we wanted to put to the audience because you're a part of this conversation as well. And they're on your screen. And if we could, which I think is a polling, if you're a funder, we want to understand, do you give general operating support? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. We want to understand for organizations that are out there, if you're an organization, do you receive general operating support? And also, does your organization prioritize funding organizations led by people of color? Lastly, we want to understand who's in leadership. And you may say, what does this have to do with this conversation that we're getting ready to engage in? It has everything to do with this conversation. As we think through racial equity and dealing with the persistent issues that plague our communities, we know that general operating support is important. We know that having leadership that reflects the people that we're serving is important. And we also know that philanthropy somehow sits right in the crux of all of that. So we're good, as this poll continues, we're going to continue to start our discussion. And I'm going to just put it out to everyone. Solving racism begins with directly addressing America's persistent economic and social inequality. And as we think about those words, social and justice and inequality, I thought maybe we'll start with, what do we mean by those words? And so Miki, I'm gonna start with you. When you hear the words social justice or racial justice, what does that mean to you now?
I think it means, for me, and in some of the conversations I've had with other people, it's really about digging into acknowledging and then taking sharp action to address the disparate outcomes for white and non-white communities. I mean, let's call it out for what it is. It also means that it's more than just words, that for me, social justice is about taking the actions, making hard decisions about how you allocate resources and how you use your voice and power for those of us who have them.
So Miki, I think when you said how we use our voice and power, you know, it brought to mind for me the role of philanthropy. And Orlando, you sit in the seat of the Boston Foundation, probably one of the most powerful seats in the Boston Foundation. How do you use those words within philanthropy to move the needle?
Yeah, I want to build off of Miki's comment a little bit in terms of this definition of racial justice for me. This is, not the adopted definition by the foundation or anyone else, but I think we first have to recognize the systems and structures of oppression that have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. Like, we really have to sort of unpack and understand what those systems and structures have done to communities of color to really even have a chance at getting at, the underlying issues that we all care about. I think sometimes we jump too fast to trying to fill our boards and organizations with people of color and sort of check a diversity box without thinking deeply about what these systems have done to people in communities. And I feel we have to start there. For the Boston Foundation, one of the things that we've tried to do, at least from my seat in the program department, is create a set of shared principles around how we think about our grant making. So including things like, we will make grants through a racial equity lens. We will value the lived experience of the communities that we are trying to serve. And just to be able to set that sort of expectation of how we want to evolve and transform as a philanthropic organization, for us, as we begin to clear the way for, I think, some really innovative grant making work using sort of a racial justice, racial equity lens.
Thank you for sharing that. Eric, as I think about the Lenny Zakim Fund, the Lenny Zakim Fund is deeply committed to social justice and the fundamental rights and dignity of all people. So your website says. So how are you all defining racial justice, social justice, particularly at your fund in grant making?
Yeah, so for us, the Zakim Fund, and even us as an organization that's been around for 25 years has blind spots, but social, racial, and economic justice is, all encompassing. So it's accessibility, it's housing instability and affordability, it's empowering grassroots leaders, so people who are often leading organizations that are representative of the community that they're serving. So, sometimes, the cliche of, not cliche, but the quote of people closest to the pain, often the ones coming up with the solutions. So really it's about recognizing those hidden gems or those grassroots organizations that are, trying to get their ideas seeded, because often, similar to, the reports around disparities in funding, there's disparities in ideas being seeded when those ideas are coming from people of color or grassroots communities or low-income communities as well.
And Rahsaan, you sit on the board of an organization that is really at the funds a number of grassroots organizations. And kind of this is your space that you see your organization leaning into the community. How does HIAMS define racial justice? And I'm curious, what's your spin that you put on it, particularly coming from the ACLU?
Well, our definition of racial justice is informed by our vision, which is to, envision a future where the society, the systems and the structures are transformed to create conditions for increased collective well-being and produce equitable power, access, opportunities, and outcomes regardless of race. And so, understanding the work that HIAMS is engaged in can be looked at, I think traditionally has been looked at through the lens of racial equity, right? What are we doing to address historical and systemic racism and the effects of white supremacy? But the racial justice lens, I think, adds another layer onto it, because the premise, at least for me, that is built into racial justice, and this taps into another hat that I wear, separate and apart from being on the board at Hyams and being a civil rights attorney at the ACLU, but also being an ordained reverend, that justice connotes something larger, that it suggests that there should be some sort of some healing and some restoration and transformation. And so beyond a racial equity analysis, there needs to be a reconciling and a healing and bringing people to a better place than they were because of the injustices that they have faced. And so by working directly with the folks who are most impacted, by empowering them or, you know, providing resources so that their power can be built out, I think is really key, and not restraining them so much, which I think is a struggle or a serious tension that exists in philanthropy, but then also being very intentional about who we're funding, right? We're looking at board makeup. We're looking at leadership of the organization in addition to what community is being served. And those are very important requirements for us. And to the extent that, and you raised this in your premise, your earlier question about leadership and how this matters. Like, I brag all the time about our board because of the 9 people that are on our board, only one of them is white, right? And so, and these are individuals with very profound resumes and deep professional experience. And so it pushes back against this notion that exists out there where we just can't find the people. You know, racial justice is doing that work to bring the people on board so that there can be this reconciliation, so that there can be this transformation and healing.
Can I?
Yes, please do, Orlando.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to build on a couple points that Rahsaan raised and a question that you asked: what can philanthropy do? I think we all should push ourselves to think about how we are sharing power around the distribution of our resources, and so the participatory grant making, whatever you are calling it these days. But if we are moving in a direction where we believe that those who are most proximate to the problem, I mean, it seems like we're at a place in our country right now that we're listening more to those closest to the pain, as Eric suggested. We can walk the walk by also sharing power with how resources, philanthropic resources, are distributed. And the other point I want to touch on is this point about tracking the data and knowing exactly who is getting the money, and who are the leaders of the organizations who are getting the money, and what are their board representation. I don't think we have done enough in philanthropy to intentionally collect that data and think about what the picture that's being presented really means for who has the benefit of getting philanthropic resources. And so I think those are 2 things we can do as philanthropic organizations.
And to build further on that point, Orlando, if I may, I think this notion of data is one that we need to grapple with in a couple of different ways. One is data holding ourselves as philanthropy and funders accountable for how and where our resources are distributed, but also not over-relying on data to tell us where the problems are, and going back to this notion that the people who are closest and most proximate to the issues have a voice and an experience that we don't need 16 research studies to validate. And I think that there's a real problem in philanthropy that we want this nice, neat little research study to say, oh, we need to fund Black and brown boys. I think we already knew that, and yet we're waiting for the research studies half the time. So I think that's another tension that we need to solve in our field.
You know, Miki, you brought up a really good point. We know the obvious, you know, things happen, yet we're still waiting for the data. So I'm going to put this out to everyone. A lot has changed in the last, I will say, what month are we in? 7 months, right? We started with COVID, then we're in a space of racial justice, first looking at health, now really kind of looking at the whole system. So I'm asking each one of you, how has your funding priorities changed? What changed in your organization, and how and why? And Miki, I'm going to start with you. We knew prior to COVID that race was an issue. We knew prior to COVID that racial justice was not happening. How has your funding changed?
So that's speaking from a couple of different hats that I wear. One of the things I can say is that, you know, in my day job, I work with a number of high net worth individuals who are givers. And what I saw is that a number of them really started listening to some of the sort of larger organized philanthropy voices and began converting grants to general operating, began reaching out and offering flexibility. So there was this sea change for a number of them. I also, you know a number of funders who decided, no, we're not changing at all because what we're doing is already right, which I think shows that old saw that when you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation playing out as never before. And then what I've seen certainly is in some of the organizations on whose boards I sit, this reframing and focusing in on really looking at how organizations are led, who's leading those organizations, and moving towards what some people are talking about in terms of trust-based philanthropy, of sort of saying, again, we are going to believe the voices of those with the lived experiences.
Right. And Orlando, what's happening at the Boston Foundation? What has changed?
Yeah, you know, I certainly some new things have emerged. I like to think that while the last 9 months have certainly brought into more clarity the kind of transformative work that is needed in philanthropy, I like to think that we've been on our journey. A lot of work to do, as most of these philanthropic institutions have. We had already began our journey to think about how we do our grant making around these principles that I mentioned earlier. So a couple of sort of big changes that we've made. We've combined a couple of bodies of work together to make them much more potent around issues of racial equity. We combined our grassroots strategy, which felt like it was this small little program that wasn't at the center of the foundation's work. We combine that with our nonprofit effectiveness work to develop something that we're calling the social justice framework, which is meant to support other nonprofit organizations as we work on ourselves in this transformative work around racial equity, to do other things like support movement leaders, to think more about participatory grant making within the foundation. And so I wouldn't say that was necessarily sparked by the pandemic and the most recent killing of Black people in this country, but I think it's indicative of the direction that our journey has taken us on. And there's several others. We changed our economic development work to be mostly focused on getting capital to Black and Latino businesses, being really explicit about that's who we are targeting. Our art strategy, something like 75% of our resources are going to individual artists. 75% of them are Black or people of color. And so I think over the last year or so, we're seeing the results of some of our clearer thinking around issues of race and how it shows up in philanthropy. But we have a long way to go. I mean, we are a 100-year-old institution, so we have a lot of blind spots.
But Orlando, can you also share with us, when you mentioned earlier that you're using more of a racial justice lens. Can you give us some concrete components of what you mean by a racial justice lens, particularly for the funders that are listening? Like, what are some concrete things they should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, for us, the way that we approached it is we had, as the grant making arm of the foundation, my 30-person team did, a month-long racial equity sort of training session and came up with a set of guiding principles. We will use a racial equity lens. We will value the lived experiences of the communities that we serve. We recognize that in philanthropy, we don't have all the answers. And so it created for us, I think, a way of thinking and created cover for the leaders within my team to really lean in and step into this racial equity work. And so what you begin to see is the changing or reshaping of how resources are being allocated, questions that were being asked, how we're thinking about evaluating grants. So for me, it's starting with a clear-eyed perspective of the structural issues that exist and have existed. Having that conversation, really honest conversation as an organization, and then creating permission, I think, for your organization to fully lean into that sort of transformative work. And again, we are early days. I mean, we are trying to further our journey along, but those are just some examples of how it's playing out inside of the organization.
Mm-hmm. You know that I think those are very good, concrete things we can do. But the question is, how is it institutionalized? And Rahsaan, you sit on a board. You're in both the Boston Foundation and Heinz Foundation is in the midst of leadership change, right? So how do you make sure that whatever you're doing now is really being institutionalized and is changing the organization rather than just responding to a moment? So Rahsaan, what are some of the things that you all are thinking about, particularly as you're in a leadership change?
Right. Well, so we're trying to have a better understanding of the things that we have done that have worked well, that have spoken to this moment. There were certainly some pivoting that we had to do in response to the pandemic, but we also felt that we were built out in such a way that we had access and connection to the folks on the ground who were experiencing the greatest brunt of this pandemic. And so that is an affirmation of how we feel that we are doing the work in a way that is consistent with our racial justice values and principles. But then to the other larger structural pieces, we're at the, we have gone past our 5 years on our current strategic plan. And so we're in the process of reevaluating and reconsidering what the plan does, what we decided to do maybe close to 6 years ago, does it still hold up? And to the extent that it does, what are those critical pillars that our work rests on that has been effective and has made an impact? But then what are the other areas that we need to really work on or reconsider? I think, the general operating support conversation is something that a while back within the strategic framework that we were operating within, we felt like we need to do more general operating support and funding. And I think we're funding like maybe close to 70% in that way. So that's a significant amount instead of tying people's hands. They know what the issues are. They know how to do the work. Get the people the money and let them do the work. So as we transition into new leadership, we don't want to come up with a strategic plan and then bring somebody else and say, this is what we've got and now run with it. And so it's stretching out the process a little bit, but it gives us the opportunity to really build off of some of the things that we're doing and look into new opportunities to really speak to the moment. And here's the other thing, right? The issues that have surfaced during this pandemic are going to surface during the next pandemic, whether it's an environmental crisis, whether it's an economic crisis, whether it's another health crisis, or whether it's a tyrannical government crisis. The people who are being impacted now are going to be the same people who are being impacted across all of those various scenarios. And so we want to make sure that the way that we do the work and the structures that we have in place to respond to the concerns, but also engage and lift up the folks who are doing it, and so that they have the resources and the ability and the network to do that are the things that we want to make solid moving forward.
You've all mentioned pretty much general operating support, and that's a question. So we have basically only half of the funders that are on the call or on this webinar that said that they often give general operating support. And for the organizations, do you receive general operating support? It's a little bit better. Well, actually, I don't know how this is faring out, but at least 50% said no, even though 69% said, 70% said yes. I'm sorry, 42% said that they are not receiving it, 43%, but something is getting in the way. And so what's the real conversation here around general operating support? If we really trust, and I want to go to Miki's point, trust-based philanthropy, you got to trust your grantees. We're really trusting them. What's the deal with program support? And will program support or general operating support really get us closer to racial equity? So I'm gonna start with you, Eric, because you're a social justice fund. You put it right out there. Which one is gonna move us closer? Is it to racial equity? Is it program support or is it general op?
So for me, I think it's starts with a recognition of building off what Rahsaan said about we don't know what we don't know and we don't know who we don't know. So it's, I think the unrestricted general operating support goes further, but it's really about capacity building. So the Zakim Fund, we're not a foundation, we're more of a public charity. So it's grant making, but it's also the tools and training and resources and networking and connections and referrals to help build stronger organizations. So help build stronger nonprofit leaders and managers, and even the pipeline of people who can then move up the ranks in terms of building their acumen, whether it's financial, fundraising, fiscal, program management. So it's kind of the full spectrum of support, where that general operating support allows organizations to not have to pigeonhole themselves and bend towards either, you know, a foundation or a funder's strategic plan funding priorities, but really allow them the flexibility to fund their programming, but also take care of kind of the administrative and operational capacity needs of that organization. Because also many of the organizations led by people of color in this state are smaller in terms of budget size. So there's just a lot more pressure put on fewer people to do the work.
Miki, can you share more, particularly as you are a strategist, you're talking to donors directly. What's your thought on what is going to really move us closer to racial equity? Is it program? Is it general operating? How are you advising people?
So I think it's a range of things. And I want to pick back up on this conversation where you sort of started with, you know, if we trust. And the reality is that many funders don't trust nonprofits for, I think, any number of reasons. And I think part of it is the unknown, that many funders don't know their grantees at really deep levels. Sometimes it's a capacity issue. You might have a funder that has a ton of nonprofits, doesn't have bandwidth to know them. In other cases, this is a part-time gig for a family who doesn't have paid staff. But I think that there's often a barrier to trust, which is the first thing that we have to overcome. And ironically, polls show that the general public actually trusts the nonprofit sector more than they trust, say, the federal government or any number of other structures. But yet there's still this funny barrier that when I'm giving you a grant, somehow I need to put all these strings on it. And I think that's a conversation that we need to have about how do we as funders hold ourselves accountable? Because what we are told as funders is you have these scarce resources, you have to, quote, invest them wisely. And so what does that look like? And making sure that, I mean, to answer your original question, I think general operating support is always the most impactful grant, because people need to pay their light bills. They need to be able to respond to emerging situations. We think about just what happened in March as the world went to work from home. Suddenly nonprofits had a whole new set of expenses that they never had before. They might have had to buy laptops for their staff or any number of other things. They needed that flexibility to sort of morph and change so they could keep moving services forward, which is also racial and social equity. So I think the conversation is, how do we help philanthropists, individuals, funders, corporations, whatever you want to call those philanthropists, really understand that trust is possible and should be the starting point.
Yeah. Miki, thank you so much for bringing us back to that trust point, because, and I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, because Orlando, I'm gonna move right there. Rahsaan, did you want to jump in on the trust piece?
Yeah, oh, well, yeah, I did want to jump in. Oh, can I?
Please.
Oh, I mean, so, you know, it is about trust, but we have to ask a question about, you know, and it's more rhetorical than anything, about why that trust doesn't exist. And if we're not talking about white supremacy and white dominant culture, we're really not going to get to the heart of why there is a lack of trust. And we can tease that apart and dismantle that, or spend time talking about it and have people get in their feelings about how they're not racist. And it's not about being racist, but it's about dismantling the narratives that exist about why people in certain communities and their communities are in the conditions that they are in, what the structural impediments and barriers that are baked in to all of the institutions and structures that prevent them from having been able to develop the skills, the assets, the resources, but then also how individuals' personal biases play into a perception of someone's status and condition and their ability to run an organization. And so, like, yes, trust, but why is there a lack of trust? And I think that has a, trying to understand how the norms of white dominant culture, which are a function of white supremacy, until we deal with that, people are going to say, no, I trust them, but it's always the yes, but. We got to deal with that.
But, philanthropy is hard-baked with that. You don't have philanthropy, and philanthropy is the baby of really capitalism, right? And philanthropy is the baby of that culture that you're talking about. So we adapt business terms, we adapt our evaluations from a space and a place that is somewhat at odds with the trust. So for Orlando, one of the things I'm kind of thinking about when you think about this question of trust or this issue of trust, what's going to get us there faster to this anti-racist space that we've been kind of talking around, but we're going to go there more directly in a moment. Is it going to be program support or operating support? Because, and I'm going to add a twist to this, 1965, you gave operating support to people. They just continued on the way that they were, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have to say, no, the money's going to go in this direction through this program to even wake people up. So is it, to get to this more racial equity space, is it program support? Is it operating support? And where does trust become a factor?
Yeah, we made a switch to operating support, multi-year operating support many years ago. But I think this trust issue and the relationship that philanthropy has with community and leaders in community is something that needs to be sort of broken down and addressed, right? Because I think in philanthropy, we live in this ivory tower, dropping money into communities to help po folks, and very seldom do we build the kind of relationships. And this is where your hiring practices come into play as well. Who are the people at the foundation who can best represent and be in conversation and in community with community becomes really important as well in my estimation. So yeah, general operating support for sure. I think to Eric's point earlier, foundation needs to fund much more technical assistance for organizations. We have incredible leaders who have been locked out of these ways to get capital, and they, in some cases, they may need support. We should fund that support, in my opinion. But yeah, I think general operating support, yes, all day, every day, I think is the way that we should go. But I think this sort of trust issue and how you really get at that, this relationship between philanthropy and those we are trying to serve has got to be stronger.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
Well, just to build off the trust, just a quick thing around, for me, you referenced capitalism, but yes, and it is based on taking risks. So even though it's, philanthropy is an offshoot of capitalism, capitalism is rooted in taking risks. So, why can't philanthropy take more risk in terms of who it's trusting, who it's investing in? So, one of the things I try to think about is, reframe who's considered the expert. So, it applies to a lot of different realms, whether it's, who's on panels, who's making the decisions. I think Orlando referenced participatory grant making. So even what we're trying to do is expand our network and sphere of influence so that there's more people from the community and people, not just, racial ethnicities, but, people from the accessibility community and things like that are a part of our decision-making process. So sharing the power, but also rethinking who is considered an expert to be able to be a part of that decision-making process.
And I'm so happy you brought that up, because that was going to be my next piece. There's a lot of R&D, right? Research and development that happens in corporations, and corporations do take a lot of risk. And with that in mind, I know this is not a question that we discussed, but it's coming up for me. Why is philanthropy so opaque? We have a number of people that are on this call that are nonprofits and find it hard to break into philanthropy, not just a job, but even getting grants. Why are those doors not just flung open to take more risk, knowing that the world has changed, how do we help philanthropy become more democratic or more open, that everyone can find their way to the right donor, to the right philanthropic organization, to ensure that we are moving progress forward? So I'm going to start with Miki. Why do you think philanthropy remains so opaque, and why is it so hard?
Are you starting with me because my last name starts with A? You're going alphabetically?
Alphabetically. So unfortunately, Orlando, you got a lot of time to think.
I'm thinking.
Oh.
So it's a tough question. I think that it comes from a number of factors. And if I sort of think about some buckets of philanthropists, because philanthropy obviously is not a monolithic thing. It's highly diverse. You've got everything from highly staffed, huge organizations like the Gates Foundation and the Ford Foundation with hundreds and hundreds or thousands of staffers, down to small family foundations that have no staff whatsoever and meet together over the Thanksgiving dinner table, to the individual donor who maybe has a donor advised fund. And so there's not one, I think that's part of the challenge, is that there's not a single door in, or even a half dozen doors in. There are thousands of doors in, some of which are very deliberately hidden for various reasons based on people's personal preferences, sense of need of privacy, or even their own personal security. So I think that the challenge for the nonprofit sector, and I don't know exactly how we solve this, is that there is no single point of entry. So we have to then think about, for those foundations or sources of funds that are more open, how do each of us who have positions of power or influence help each of those become more transparent? And then, ultimately, this is, just off the top of my head, how do we then maybe think about aggregate platforms where foundations could maybe band together for single points of application to multiple sources? We now have, I understand in the college space, that's sort of single application to multiple colleges. Could we have something like that for funders?
Great. Eric, what is your thought here? How do we make philanthropy more, how do we democratize philanthropy? How do we help, whether it's the funder that's listening, become more open, or whether it's the nonprofit with a great idea, say, how do I get in? How do I get to you all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of streamlining processes. So, what had become apparent very early in March and April is that things that were seemingly radical before were clearly less radical and easily implementable in terms of minimizing kind of the application burden for nonprofits, streamlining application processes, providing more web-based support and informational sessions. So those things that some organizations and funders had been doing, a lot more kind of rose to the occasion. So you saw several different funder pledges around changing the way that they were doing things to be much more responsive. And I think that's something that could be a norm going forward. So that's one set. On the other hand, I think it's also kind of taking more time to listen to your current grantees, your existing network, and also seeking referrals and connections through those organizations. So I referenced capacity building earlier. It's not just me or our staff dictating these are the things that we think you should be learning. It's also asking people, what do you want to learn more about? What do you need? What help and support would be most useful for you, given where you are on your kind of organization's life cycle and where you are. So I think it's a combination of listening, but also kind of paying attention and literally keeping your ear to the ground.
Rahsaan, what is your thought there? You are at a medium sort of philanthropic institution, and you're sitting on the board. We know organizations are out there. How do they get in touch with HIAMS? How do they share their great idea? Well, how do you keep that ear to the ground and making sure that this is open to everyone?
like I said earlier, I like to brag on Hyams because when you think about our board, it's predominantly people of color. When you think about our staff, it's predominantly people of color who have deep connections in community and strong relationships. And you know, there is always room for improvement, but I think our staff does a tremendous job of strengthening the connections that they have. I think another role of philanthropy and leaders in philanthropy is to convene, to bring people together who might not regularly come together and share space. And particularly for those of us who are, you know, on the cutting edge of doing racial justice work, to not only bring, you know, other philanthropic organizations together for them to talk, but for them to hear from the people who are on the ground doing the work, and to hear the practical realities of some of the constraints of how philanthropy has operated and may have held back their organizations from thriving and succeeding. And for, you know, organizations or foundations like Hyams and others that have a similar mindset to help facilitate the conversation to push push the sector further into this racial justice space. So I think that's a key part of it. And then the role that philanthropy plays in influencing the narrative. And sometimes, and I think, you know, philanthropy, we do that. Some of us are better at it than others. Some of us are more intentional about how we do it than others, but there's also a risk because of the profile and the cachet that a certain philanthropy or foundation holds, that also runs the risk of feeding into problematic narratives as well. But since this is a conversation about racial justice and bringing an anti-racist lens to philanthropy, I think that's also something that there needs to be a lot of work on, so that we're not unintentionally solidifying problematic narratives as well.
So you said keeping your ear to the ground and listening. I've heard this a couple of times. How do you do that? Like, what is different about your communication with your funders right now, with your grantees right now? And how are you communicating with them differently? What's different? What are some concrete things that you can offer for the funders, but also where are you showing up differently? And Rahsaan, I really would like to know from a Hyams point of view, how are you showing up differently now than you were in the past, that people can gravitate and share what they're doing and what they're seeing right now?
Right. So one of the things that I think is important is language. And so, like, we don't refer to the folks we work with as grantees. We refer to them as partners, and that shapes how we think about the work that we do. And we invite our partners in for learning sessions to edify the board and the staff, so that we can have a better understanding. Because to the extent that we're considering, you know, project-related investments, mission-related investments, what are the kind of emerging areas, we recognize that we don't know it all. And so to invite people in and to have those conversations, I think is key. I think, you know, in part, the relationships that staff have and the conversations that they're having, picking up the phone and checking in on our community partners and finding out what the needs are and what are the emerging trends that they have to respond to. I think those are some of the critical ways that we're making ourselves available and engaging in a way that is somewhat different, and also being contemplative around how we show up publicly in social media. And that's something that we're moving towards, kind of the strategic communications aspect of it. And so I think that's something that's another way, because the more people know about the work that's getting done, one, that sends a signal to potential community partners that there's an opportunity for funding there. But it also signals to the rest of the field that here are some of the things that can be done. And then again, and we haven't done this as much this year because of the pandemic, but again, convenings, bringing people together, and engaging in those conversations that are multifaceted with perspectives from the community partner as well as the foundations as well.
Can I?
Please, Orlando, share
Yeah.
what your thoughts.
Yeah. Just adding on two things. One, I think this the relationship between the program officer and the community. I'm not even not the grantee, but the community. I think is really important, and the ability to develop really authentic relationships is really important. I often refer to my team. I don't think of us as grant makers. I think of us as partners in community that happen to have resources to help good work that's happening in community. And so to Rahsaan's point, convening, showing up, being present in community are all ways that you begin to build trust, I think. I also think I'm putting a lot of energy into this participatory grant making type work. It's a way to get community voice in the process, but it's also a way to authentically welcome people into a foundation, because we are going to be partners on how these resources are distributed. We have a few examples now, and how we're using participatory grant making. But I think it's a way to deepen the relationship that philanthropy has with community that ultimately, hopefully, leads to more impact and opening up the doors to these institutions, so people understand they're not, they understand how the sausage is made, so to speak.
I really, really appreciate that. And we know participatory grant making isn't new, because normally we invite the donors in to make those decisions. And for us to now start to invite the people who know best, I think you're right, Orlando, that is the right space to move towards. As we wrap up, because we're going to move to the Q&A, I can't be, because King Boston is involved, it constantly reminds philanthropy, it constantly reminds me of his quote, philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice, which makes philanthropy necessary. And I take that quote to heart, because a long time ago as a grant maker, we are in partnership, but we have to be aware of power. And we have to be aware of also how we sit in our power, and how our community sits in their power as well. And I want to thank each and every one of you for this discussion, but also invite you into another space with us as we start to think through, how do we create a space and place to ensure that we're moving towards an anti-racist philanthropic community. I think each and every one of you has said a lot here, whether it's convening, listening, keeping your ear to the ground, whether it's making philanthropy less opaque. How do we really, truly start to democratize philanthropy is really left up to us. And for those of you that are listening, we hope that you have found this conversation to be not only insightful, but we're all going to hold each other accountable. And you're all now part of our inner circle to help us really think through, how do we make this less opaque? How do we really increase racial justice? And we're going to lean in on you all to do some of the things that you all have not only recommended, but also lead the way on how to do these things concretely. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Imari, who I think has a set of questions from the audience. And thank you so much for allowing me to moderate this discussion.
Thank you, Bithiah. Thank you, panelists. If we were live, I would be running around with the microphone, chasing people with their hands up. So I'm going to try my best, and I'll do a little wiggle dance to replicate running around a Zoom meeting, if that helps. So one of the first questions that we have comes from the audience, and it talks about a recent study that came out talking about how organizations led by people of color have a more difficult time leveraging philanthropic dollars. Can the panel speak on what can philanthropy do to change that trend or support leaders of color to access those philanthropic dollars in a different way?
Well, look, I've spent most of my life raising money, so I know as a Black man, I know how hard it is to break in and get those resources. There are, a couple of people around this panel who have been really supportive of my leadership on the fundraising side over the years. I think this thing that Miki and I talk around data, foundations having clear data and understanding of what percentage of their resources are going to people of color, right? Because I think a lot of us don't even realize that there is a gap. We think we're funding work that supports Black and brown people, and we kind of stop there. We don't go the extra level to figure out who's the leaders of these organizations, and counting that also towards successful grant making.
I'll just add on, sorry, I'll be brief, but one also just around, I mentioned kind of streamlining processes. So, there are some processes that involve letters of interest and then an application process. There's invite-only RFP processes. So it's also kind of flattening the hierarchy in terms of the ability to access, because often those organizations don't have a development team. There's a development person or someone who has a job and is also the development person, or the executive director is also the fundraiser. So it's recognizing the minimized capacity and then tapping into, minimizing those, burdens to be able to tap into that capital. And also, if there's a way, intentionally supporting organizations led by people of color. So we had a cohort that was specifically for organizations led by people of color, and there's several other entities like that in the region as well.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to jump around and try to get as many of these questions as I can. One of the other questions talks about boards. And so, the nonprofit sector is oftentimes guilty of buying into over-credentialing, over-education, over-qualification necessary to be a part of nonprofit boards, but most also importantly, philanthropic boards. Can you talk about your perspective and what can we do as leaders of color, as a sector, to increase the representation of folks of color on these philanthropic boards?
I'd like to jump in there. Certainly welcome other voices. And I think one of the most profound comments I had was talking to a white leader of an organization in another state who wanted to increase the diversity on his board. And he said, I don't know who I don't know. His point being that his networks were never going to get him to the kinds of representational voices that he actually wanted on this board. And so I think there's a couple of things. One is you've got to put some effort in. There's some sweat equity here about increasing the people reaching out to circles, the circles beyond that, and the circles beyond that, because there are so many qualified, wonderful voices out there that we're not currently hearing from. I think the other elephant in the room, particularly for public charities, is that when we think about boards, we also think about fundraising. And so if you have a give-get minimum on your board, you may be taking people out of consideration who have really valuable things to say about the governance of your organization, because you've set an economic threshold that just doesn't make sense. And so I would look really carefully at what qualifications you're putting on people on your boards, and also think about the governing board and other kinds of boards, advisory boards, investment boards, other kinds of ways that you can include people, because not everybody necessarily wants to be on a governing board. So a couple ideas there.
In addition to doing the work, which is key, and this has always been a point of tension for me. Like, structural racism is not people of color's problem, but we have to deal with it and fix it at every turn. And so, the charge is for white people in positions of authority and power to actually do the work. And certainly, to Miki's point, like, you don't know who you don't know, but you can find out who you don't know, and you can connect with who you don't know and build that work out. And then there's also some money that you can put down on the table and hire a search firm. And there's search firms that specialize in identifying people that are going to meet the credentials that that an organization is looking for. But it's 2020, y'all. We should be long past the point of saying, I can't find anybody, because it's an unacceptable response at this time, particularly with all of the networking and resources that people have and can be connected to.
Thank you. One of the other conversations that has made the public sphere has been HR 40. the conversations on reparations. And we've seen a lot of higher ed institutions like Georgetown and like Brown begin this conversation on what it means for their institutions to engage in a reparations conversation. What's the role of philanthropy in engaging in the reparations conversation? And if you've thought about it, what are some ideas that philanthropy could do to enhance and play a large part in this discourse?
You know, that's an interesting question, because it cuts both ways, because we're talking about reparations, we're talking about some sort of recompense for the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans and years of oppression through Jim Crow segregation and the other systems of oppression that have operated in our society, to the benefit of a great wealth in the hands of a very small few, who have in some instances gone on to create philanthropies. And so if we're talking about reparations, sometimes that's more than just grant making, but it's just like, here's money to a community that the founder of this philanthropy was able to start because of this wealth that is an outgrowth of structural racism or exploitive predatory capitalist system. But to the extent that that is not the lane that our particular foundation grows out of, or folks just aren't ready to engage that conversation, I think that there are a lot of conversations that are happening across the country around reparations, and again, I think a lot of this goes back to narrative. We, as a country, we have to understand why reparations are so necessary, right? The inordinate amount of wealth that was amassed in this country through the institution of slavery and the subsequent subjugation of Black people is something that cannot be denied. And I think that's why the 1619 Project is so valuable. The fact that people are just now, there are people who are less like, I was today years old when I found out about the Tulsa massacre. Like, that's unacceptable. But at the same time, it's a good thing that that's happening. And so there's a role for philanthropy to play in lifting up the stories. And that's what HR 40 is really getting to, is the creation of a commission that would study. So we have to do a recounting of all of the ways that Black people have been robbed, have been denied of access, and how wealth has been generated off of our free labor. And to the extent that philanthropy can lift those stories up, create venues and convenings for those conversations to happen, and then also leverage our influence to engage in some other types of creative spaces. There are funds that are being created to address systemic historical racism, even if a corporation or an agency or foundation wasn't directly involved or did not directly benefit. BECMA, the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, has created the Black Mass Coalition that is looking to venture capital and banks and philanthropy and government to pour into a fund that would address deep structural racial inequities. And so I think those are some of the things and ways that we can play in this space.
The only thing I would add is just that, I think there is a role for philanthropy to convene and educate. I think in the last 3 or 4 days, I've had four white men talk to me, not usual suspects, talk to me about wanting to think through reparations. And I'm like, wow, we're in a different place. And I don't want to be a Black man again that has to tell you about, all the history of racism in this country. But I mean, there is an opportunity there to bring some people along in the conversation. So maybe one of the roles that philanthropy can play is to convene conversations and build momentum around what reparations might look like and how people can be partners in that work.
Okay, Eric, you had something to say, and then Miki, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to say a good word, because I see that we're closing in. So Eric, and then I'll go to you, Miki.
I'll be brief. So just touching on the wealth gap. So separate from reparations, I think there's also the opportunity to look inward, especially for funders around, who are your consultants? Who are you paying? You're a business, funders are businesses. So you're contracting out with other companies. So who is managing your endowment? Who's managing the money? Who are your paid consultants? Who's doing the tax and audit preparation? So there's certainly also ways other than grant making where, it touches on that concept of reparations. How are you investing your money in other ways to then bridge that racial wealth gap?
Miki, final word?
I think all the great ideas have come before. I would also just add two tiny nuances. One is for endowed foundations using program-related investments to sort of build on Eric's point about how you're using your other capital in community, and continuing to lift up the voices that philanthropy should be the risk capital, and so making those risky investments in terms of pushing forward the tough conversations.
Thank you all. We're so excited that you all could be here today. I want to thank our panelists, Orlando, Miki, Rahsaan, Eric, and our wonderful moderator, Bithiah Carter. Thank our incredible back office producer, Natisha Mills, who is responsible for everything and running the show today. I want to thank everyone who spent the last hour having and engaging in this incredible conversation. Thank you, King Boston, Lenny, Zakim, and all of our friends. We want to thank you for this conversation. And as Dr. Kendi talked about in his book, How to Be Anti-Racism, policy begets ideology, and ideology begets behavior. And I'm so excited that we begin this conversation to think about how philanthropy can change policy to shape ideology and have our sector respond in different ways. Thank you all. Thank all of our panelists, and have a wonderful and great day. Thank you all.